I was 9 years old the first time someone tried to make me smaller than I was born to be, and I remember it not as a wound, but as the day I learned what a single man's stillness could hold up when everything else in a great hall bent and gave way. They call me a woman grown now. They put my mother's colors on me and my mother's name in their prayers, and when the children of the almshouses ask me for a story, I do not tell them about crowns or victories. I tell them about a stone floor, a command spoken in a voice sweet as poured honey, and a soldier who did not move until the exact moment the whole world needed him to. If you have ever wondered whether one person standing correctly in a room full of people standing wrongly can change anything at all, then sit, and let me tell you about Serjeant Edric Thorne. And the afternoon the Queen Consort Morwenna decided that a 9-year-old girl should learn her place on her knees. It happened in the long gallery of Harrowgate, on the day my mother's portrait was to be raised. You must understand what that day meant, or nothing after will land the way it should. My mother was Queen Isolde, and she had been dead 2 winters by then. The realm had loved her the way people love clean water, without noticing how much they leaned on it until it was gone. She had walked the flood districts when the river came up over the low streets. She had sat with dying soldiers in the border hospitals and written their letters home in her own hand, because she said a mother should not receive her son's last words in a clerk's tidy script. When she died, the bells rang for a week, and men who had never wept in their lives stood in the rain outside the palace gates with their hats in their hands. The kingdom of Eldermore buried a queen and did not quite know how to go on being a kingdom without her. My father, King Alaric, grieved the way kings are permitted to grieve, which is to say briefly and then behind a closed door, and within the year he married again. Her name was Morwenna, and I will try to be fair to her, because my mother taught me that cruelty is easier to understand than to forgive, and that the second is the harder and better work. Morwenna came from a proud house that had never quite had the standing it believed it deserved, and she had spent her whole life a half-step behind women she considered her lesser. When she married my father, she did not marry a man. She married a correction. She married the chance to walk first through every door she had ever waited outside of. She brought with her 2 grown children of her own from a former marriage, my half-brother by law, Lord Cassius, sleek and smiling and always calculating the weight of a room, and my half-sister Lady Verena, who could make a curtsy feel like an insult and an insult feel like a favor. And she brought a hunger that the whole palace could feel, the way you feel a storm before the sky changes, a hunger to be not merely the king's wife but the true and only queen, with the memory of the woman before her sanded down until nothing of her was left. She could not sand my mother away. That was the trouble at the root of everything. The realm would not let her. And so on the day they raised my mother's portrait in the long gallery, Morwenna arrived dressed like a thundercloud in cloth of silver, and she came looking for a way to make the day about herself. I did not know any of this at 9. At 9, I knew only that I was to wear the blue gown that had been my mother's favorite color on me, and that my hair had been braided so tightly by a nervous lady's maid that my scalp ached, and that I was frightened of the crowd. The long gallery is a vast room, longer than it is wide, lined its whole length with tall windows on one side, and on the other the painted faces of every Queen Eldermore had ever crowned. There is a warm gold light in there in the afternoon that lies along the floor like a carpet, and the floor itself is old stone, worn smooth and cold, pale as bone. I remember the cold of it coming up through my thin shoes. I remember my little brother Bram, who was 6, holding the hem of my sleeve because the room was full of legs and he could not see over any of them. I remember my brother Torrin, who was 11 and thought himself a man, standing very straight beside me and pretending he was not also frightened. And I remember the guards. There were guards along the whole length of the gallery, one to every second window, still as the pillars between them. You have seen them, or men like them, the tall bearskin caps, the red wool tunics buttoned to the throat, the white gloves, the polished medals, the long rifles held just so. As a small child I had believed they were not entirely people. I thought perhaps the palace grew them, the way it grew its statues and its suits of armor and set them along the walls to hold the building up. They did not look at you. They did not speak. If you waved at them, they did not wave back. And I had learned young to stop trying, because it embarrassed the grown-ups, and I thought it must embarrass the guards too, to be waved at like animals in a menagerie. The one nearest the door where my mother's portrait would enter was Serjeant Edric Thorne, though of course I did not know his name that afternoon. I knew only that he was older than most of them, that there was gray in the little of his hair I could see beneath the cap, and that his face had the weathered, settled look of a man who had stood in worse places than a warm gallery. There was a long pale line of an old scar along the side of his jaw. His eyes were fixed on the middle distance, on nothing, on the discipline of nothing. He was, to my child's eye, the most perfectly a statue of all the statues in the room. What I did not know, what I would only learn years later, and what changes the whole shape of the story once you know it, was that Serjeant Thorne had stood at my mother's door on the last night of her life. He had been on the door of her sick room when the physicians came and went with their grave faces, and it was to him, in the gray hour before dawn, that my mother had spoken her last order as a queen. She had not asked him for water or for a priest. She had beckoned him close, this soldier she had known for 20 years since he was a raw recruit and she a young bride newly come to a foreign court, and she had said, "Watch over my children when I cannot," not as a courtesy, as a command. The last command of Queen Isolde, given to the one man in the palace she trusted to keep it. He had said, "Yes, my queen." And then she had died and he had gone back to his post, and he had told no one, because a guard's vows are not for telling. He had simply carried it, silent, for 2 years, standing his stone stations along the palace walls with the last order of a dead queen, folded up inside his chest like a letter he could not put down. I tell you this now so that you understand. When the moment came, Serjeant Thorne was not deciding whether to act. He had decided already, 2 winters before, in the dark, at a dying woman's bedside. Everything I am about to describe was only the keeping of a promise he had never for 1 hour set aside. But at the time, none of us knew that. At the time we saw only a soldier, and the soldiers did not save people. That was the whole terror of it when it came. The soldiers stood along the walls, and the walls did not move. The ceremony was meant to be simple. My father would say a few words. A curtain would be drawn back from the portrait. The court would bow their heads a moment for the late queen, and then there would be a small reception, wine and honey cakes, and the great people of Eldermore would murmur to one another about how well the likeness had been caught and how sad it all was, and then they would go home. My aunt, the Princess Adela, my father's sister, a tall, spare woman with my grandmother's iron in her spine, had arranged the whole thing, and she had arranged it, I later understood, quite deliberately, as a day that belonged to my mother and to my mother's children and to no one else. That, I think, is what Morwenna could not abide, a day in her own house that was not hers. My father was late, that detail matters, so hold on to it. A delegation had come from over the mountains, envoys of a neighboring crown, and they had arrived that morning without proper warning, as such men love to do, and protocol demanded the king receive them. So my father was 2 halls away in the audience chamber, bowing and being bowed to, trapped inside the machinery of state, while in the long gallery his dead wife's portrait waited under its curtain, and his living children waited on the cold stone floor. My eldest brother, the Crown Prince Rowan, was away entirely, riding the flood districts my mother had loved, doing the work she would have done. My sister Elara, who was 14 and trying very hard to be grown, stood with us and held my other hand, the one Bram was not clutching. So there we were, the 4 young children of Queen Isolde, Elara and I, and Torrin and little Bram, gathered near the curtain portrait, waiting for a father who was late, watched over by an aunt who loved us and by 24 guards who, we believed, could not help us at all. And into that gap, That small, unguarded hour, Queen Consort Morwenna walked in cloth of silver, with her son Cassius at her right hand and her daughter Verena at her left, and she looked at the four of us the way a woman looks at a stain she has been meaning to see to. She did not go to the portrait, she came to us. "Children," she said, and her voice was lovely. I want you to understand that her voice was genuinely lovely, low and warm and carrying, a voice built for filling a great room without seeming to rise. "How solemn you all look, and how unattended," she let the words sit. Around us the murmur of the gathered court thinned, because a queen speaking is a thing people stop to hear. "Where is your father, I wonder, receiving foreigners, and your eldest brother off playing in the mud with peasants?" And so it falls to me, as it always does, to see that the little ones are properly minded. Ilara's hand tightened around mine. She was old enough to hear the blade under the honey. I was not fully, but I felt her go rigid, and I felt Bram press closer into my side, and I felt the cold come up harder through my shoes. My Aunt Adela crossed the floor toward us with her long stride. "They are minded, Morwenna," she said, and there was no honey in her at all. "By me, this is Isolde's day, let it be hers." And Morwenna smiled, and the smile was where it began. "Isolde's day," she repeated, as though tasting something that had gone off. "Yes, we have had a great many of Isolde's days, haven't we? 2 years of them. The realm weeps and forgets that it has a living queen to weep for it instead." She turned from my aunt as if my aunt had ceased to exist and bent her lovely face down toward me, only me, and I felt the whole room narrow to the space between her eyes and mine. "Maelin, little Maelin, you are the very image of her, do you know that? It is quite remarkable. You have her chin, and her way of looking at people as though you are a touch too good for them. She had that. I always found it so tiresome in a queen. In a child it is simply bad manners." I did not know what to say. At 9, you do not have words for a grown woman who is being cruel to you in a voice made of music. I looked at my aunt. I looked for my father in a doorway that stayed empty. I looked without knowing why, at the row of red-coated statues along the wall, and none of them looked back. "Now," said Morwenna, straightening, raising her voice a degree so that it reached the far end of the gallery, so that the ambassadors' wives and the great lords and the whole gathered court of Eldermore could not help but hear. "I have watched you children run wild for 2 years. I have watched you receive the deference of this court as though it were owed to you by right, and never once, not once, have I seen you offer proper obeisance to the crown that shelters you. That ends today. It is time you learned where you stand. Or rather," and here she paused, and the pause was a small cruel work of art, "where you kneel." The word dropped into the gallery, and the murmur died all at once, the way a candle dies when you cap it. "I don't understand," I said. My voice came out very small. "It is not difficult to understand," Morwenna said kindly, terribly. "When you come into the presence of your queen, you kneel. Not a curtsy. A curtsy is for equals and for lords. You are neither. You are a motherless child in my household, and you will show me the respect that a subject shows her sovereign here, now, before this whole company, so that everyone present may see that the house of Harrowgate is properly ordered at last. Kneel to me, Maelin." I want you to feel the size of what she was asking, because at 9 I felt it in my body before I understood it in my head. She was not asking for good manners. There is a curtsy every child of a court learns before she can spell her own name, a dip of the knee, a bow of the head, given lightly and returned lightly, a small daily courtesy of rank. That is not what she demanded. She demanded that I go down onto both knees on the cold stone, in front of the ambassadors, in front of the painted queens, in front of my mother's curtained face, and make myself into a supplicant, a thing that begs. She demanded that the daughter of Queen Isolde kneel like a penitent to the woman who had taken her mother's place. And she demanded it on the one day the realm had set aside to honor my mother, so that the memory of Isolde and the humbling of Isolde's child would be forever fixed in the same hour, in the same room, in the mind of every person who mattered in Eldermore. She was not trying to teach me manners. She was trying to teach the whole kingdom a lesson, and I was only the slate she meant to write it on. My Aunt Adela stepped between us. "You will not," she said, low and shaking with fury. "She is a princess of the blood royal, Isolde's own daughter, and she kneels to the king and to God and to no one else living. You forget yourself, madam." "I forget nothing," said Morwenna, and now the honey was gone from her voice and something colder ran underneath. "I am Queen Consort of Eldermore, crowned and anointed, and this child is a member of my household. Do you dispute my authority over the children of this house, Adela? Shall we send for the Chamberlain and have the household ordinances read aloud? Shall we make this an even longer afternoon?" She turned her head a fraction toward the long wall, toward a fussy stooped man in black who had been hovering at the edge of the crowd. "Lord Prewitt, you keep the ordinances. Tell the Princess Adela, has the Queen Consort authority to correct the manners of the king's minor children within the household?" The Chamberlain, Lord Prewitt, went the color of tallow. He was a careful man who had survived a long time at court by never once being on the losing side of anything, and I watched him do the arithmetic in the space of a breath, the king absent, the crown prince absent, the queen present and looking at him, and I watched him choose. "The Queen Consort has broad authority in matters of household order, madam," he said to his shoes. "In the king's absence, that is the letter of it." "There," said Morwenna, pleased. "The letter of it. Now, kneel, Maelin, and we may all get on with honoring your dear mother." And no one moved. That is the part I have never been able to explain to the children of the almshouses, though I have tried. 100 people, great lords with swords at their hips, ladies who had held me as an infant. My aunt who loved me, ambassadors from a proud foreign crown who surely found the whole scene monstrous, the chamberlain who kept the very ordinances, and 24 soldiers along the walls, each one trained and armed and sworn to the crown of Eldermore. 100 people and a 9-year-old girl, and not one of the 100 moved to stand between the child and the thing being done to her. I have thought about that stillness for the rest of my life. I used to believe it was cowardice, and there was cowardice in men like Prewitt. But mostly, I came to understand, it was something quieter and worse. It was the ordinary, terrible obedience of people who have decided that keeping their own place is the first duty and the last. Every person in that gallery had calculated the cost of speaking, the way Prewitt had, and every person had found it too high. A word against the Queen was a word remembered. A friend defended today was a career ended tomorrow. So they held their tongues and studied the floor and told themselves, each in the privacy of their own fear, that it was only a child kneeling, only a small unpleasantness, only manners, and that surely someone else, someone with less to lose, would do something. There was no one else. That is the lesson at the bottom of the whole story. There is never anyone else. There is only ever you and the room and the thing that ought not to be done. Adela tried again. "Alaric will hear of this," she said, "every word of it." "I have no doubt," Morwenna said serenely. "And when he does, he will find that his household was kept in good order in his absence, and that a willful child was taught a lesson she has long needed. Kings appreciate order, Adela. You have never married one. You would not know. Now stand aside, or I will have the guard stand you aside." And she said the guard, gesturing with one silver-gloved hand toward the red-coated men along the wall, as though they were hers, as though the soldiers of Eldermore were her instrument, her furniture, a thing she might point at a princess of the blood and set in motion. And in that moment I believed her. I believed that if she told the statues to move, they would move for her, and that they would move against my aunt, and that the last friend I had in that terrible room would be dragged away by the very men whose whole purpose was to keep us safe. I looked at the nearest of them, the old one with the gray at his temples and the scar along his jaw, Serjeant Edric Thorne, though I did not know it. His eyes were forward. His rifle was still. His face had not changed by the width of a hair through all of it, not through the demand, not through the Chamberlain's cowardice, not through my aunt's fury. He was carved. He was stone. He was, I thought, hers like all of them, and my heart, which had been climbing my throat, sank all the way down into the cold coming up through my shoes. "Torrin," Morwenna said then, without looking away from me, "take your brother Bram and step back. Alara, you as well. This does not concern you. It concerns your sister, who thinks rather too much of herself. Only Maelin, kneel, child. I will not ask you a fourth time, and you will not enjoy what happens if I have to ask a fourth time." Torrin did not step back. My brother was 11 years old, and he stepped in front of me instead, this skinny boy in his good coat, and he said in a voice that cracked right down the middle, "You leave her alone." It was the bravest thing I had ever seen a person do, and it was also completely useless, and we both knew it, and I loved him so fiercely in that instant that I nearly forgot to be afraid. Verena laughed. Cassius said, smooth as oil, "Mother, the boy is spirited. Perhaps he would like to kneel as well and keep his sister company." And Morwenna smiled at her son as though he had said something clever, and I understood with the awful clarity children sometimes have that this was a game to them, that the three of them, the mother, the son, the daughter, were enjoying it, that our fear was the honey cake they had come for. "Move him," Morwenna said. And now at last a guard moved. But it was not the old one. It was a younger man 3 windows down, a big raw-boned lad not long in the uniform, and I saw him take one uncertain step off his station toward my brother, his young face twisted up with the misery of a man being made to do a thing he hates. He had heard "move him," and he had heard it as an order, and he did not know, how could he know, that it was no lawful order at all, that a queen consort has no more right to command a soldier of Eldermore to lay hands on the king's son than she has to command the sun. He only knew that a crowned head had spoken, and that he was small and new and afraid, and so he moved. He got one step, because the old guard, the stone one, the one I had given up on Serjeant Edric Thorne, turned his head. Only his head. A slow quarter turn, deliberate as a key in a lock, and he looked at the young soldier, and he said a single word quietly in a voice like a stone laid on a table. "Hold." The young man stopped, as though he had walked into a wall. And every head in the long gallery turned, because a guard had spoken, and the guards did not speak, and the sound of one of them speaking in that frozen room was like a bell rung in a tomb. Morwenna turned too. For the first time her lovely composure showed a crack, the smallest tightening at the corner of her mouth, because she had not expected the furniture to have a voice. She looked at Serjeant Thorne the way you look at a chair that has spoken to you. "You," she said, "what is your name?" He did not answer. He had faced forward again. He was stone again. And that, I have since thought, was its own kind of answer, and a more insolent one than any words would have been. He had spoken to the boy who was his to command, and he had nothing to say to her who was not. "I asked your name, soldier." "Nothing." The bearskin cap, the forward eyes, the still rifle, the scar catching the gold afternoon light. "He will give me his name," Morwenna said to the room now, her voice climbing, "and then he will give me his post because I will have it, do you hear me? A guard who countermands his queen," she pointed at the young man, who stood frozen and wretched between his station and my brother, "who tells a soldier to disobey a lawful correction of an insolent child, that man is finished. Lord Prewitt, mark him. Mark them both." "Madam," Prewitt whispered, writing nothing. And here is where I must slow down, because here is where the ground beneath the whole afternoon shifted, and I did not feel it shift at the time, being 9 and terrified, and only understood it long after. Morwenna had made a mistake. Not a mistake of the heart, her heart had been made up its whole life, but a mistake of the ground she chose to fight on. She had begun by demanding manners, which is a thing a great lady may plausibly demand, and the whole room had been able to tell itself, in its cowardice, that this was a small matter of etiquette, unpleasant but not unlawful, and therefore not worth a career to oppose. But the instant she pointed at the guards, the instant she tried to make the soldiers of Eldermore into the tools of her private cruelty, she stepped off the ground of manners and onto the ground of law. And the law of the household guard is old, and it is written, and it does not bend to the mood of a consort. A guard swears his oath to the crown and to the king's peace and to the safety of the blood royal. He does not swear it to whoever happens to be wearing the most silver in the room. Morwenna had lived at court for 2 years and had never once troubled to learn the difference, because she had never once imagined a difference she could not simply overpower. Serjeant Thorne had spent 30 years learning nothing else. I know now what was happening inside that carved and silent man while the Queen shouted for his name. He was doing the same arithmetic every other person in the gallery had done: the cost of acting, the ruin that would follow, the post lost, the pension gone, the quiet dishonorable end to a long, clean life. He was a man near 60 with no family living, and his post was the whole of his world, the walls of Harrogate the only home he had known since he was younger than that trembling boy. He had every reason the Chamberlain had, and more, to study the floor and let it happen. One child's dignity against everything he had. That was the sum he was working. And against all of it, on the other side of the ledger, he had a single thing, and the single thing outweighed the world. He had a promise made to a dying queen in the grey before a winter dawn: watch over my children when I cannot. She could not. She was 2 years in her grave, and there was her portrait under a curtain not 10 feet away, and there was her daughter on the edge of being forced to her knees, and there was no one else. There is never anyone else. And there was Edric Thorne, who had said yes, my queen, and had meant it in the way that only a certain kind of man means the small words he speaks in the dark to the dying. He was not weighing whether to keep the promise. He had kept it every hour of 2 years, standing his stations, watching us pass in the corridors, a silent, unnoticed sentinel over 4 children who had no idea they were being watched over at all. He was weighing only the moment. How long to let it run, when exactly to move, because he was a soldier, and a soldier knows that timing is everything, that a stand taken too early is only noise, easily overruled, easily forgotten, and that a stand taken at the exact hinge of a thing, when the wrong has fully shown its face and cannot be pretended away, lands with the weight of 10. He had told the boy to hold. That was the first stone. Now he waited, and he let Morwenna climb, and every rung she climbed she showed the room more plainly what she was. His name, Morwenna was saying, is not important. What is important is the lesson. Maelin. She came back to me, and she was past patience now, past the game, into something rower and more honest, which was simply the naked wish to see me brought down. You have made this longer and uglier than it needed to be. Look at your poor aunt so distressed. Look at your little brother so frightened. All of it could stop this instant. You need only kneel. It is such a small thing. Down onto your knees, head bowed, and say the words, I kneel to my queen, and it is over, and we are all friends, and we go and drink wine and look at pictures. Is your pride truly worth all this suffering? Is it? A child's stubborn pride against the peace of the whole afternoon. And this was the cleverest cruelty of all, and it nearly worked. And I will tell you honestly that it is the part I am least proud of and least ashamed of, both at once, because I was 9. She turned it around. She made the ugliness my fault. She made it so that if I simply refused, if I stood there and would not kneel, then I was the one prolonging everyone's misery, my aunt's distress, my brother's fear, the whole room's discomfort, and all I had to do to end it was give in. She offered me the oldest bargain in the world, the one every bully offers, your dignity for everyone's peace, and the longer you hold out, the more you hurt the people you love. I looked at Bram, who was crying now without sound, tears running down his round 6-year-old face while he clung to my sleeve. I looked at Alara, gray with helpless fear. I looked at Torrin standing in front of me with his fists balled, ready to be hurt on my behalf. And I thought, God forgive me, I was a child, I thought. If I just kneel, they will be safe. If I just make myself small, no one else will be hurt. It is only my pride. Mother would want me to protect them. I could make it stop. I began to kneel. I want to be precise about this, because it is the hinge of everything, and I have never once lied about it, not even to make myself braver in the telling. My knees bent. I felt the cold of the stone rise to meet me. I lowered my eyes, the way she had said, and I opened my mouth to say the words she wanted. I kneeled to my queen, and I was going to say them. And the whole gallery held its breath to watch a 9-year-old girl surrender her mother's dignity to buy an afternoon's peace. And a hand closed around my arm. Not roughly. I have felt many hands in my life since, and I have never felt one like that, a grip like a warm iron band. Absolutely certain, absolutely gentle. A hand that had held a rifle steady in the border winters and now held a child's thin arm as though it were the most precious and most breakable thing in Eldermoor, which in that moment it was. It stopped me halfway down. It did not pull me up. It simply held me, suspended, so that I could go no lower. And I looked up along the red wool sleeve and the polished buttons and the medals to the weathered face beneath the bearskin cap. And Serjeant Edric Thorne was looking down at me at last, and his eyes were not stone at all. They were the kindest and the fiercest eyes I have ever seen in a human face, and they were wet, and they were fixed on mine. And he said, so quietly that I think only I heard it, only me, in the whole enormous room. Not you, Highness, never you. And then he let go of my arm, and he stepped out of the line. A guard stepping off his station is a small movement and an enormous one. It is perhaps a single pace forward, a turn of the body, the grounding of the rifle butt on the stone with a sound like a full stop at the end of a sentence. But every soul in that gallery knew what it meant, because the guards did not do it. They stood their stations through fire and flood and the deaths of kings, and for one of them to leave his post in the middle of a ceremony was as unthinkable as one of the painted queens climbing down out of her frame. The whole room drew a breath at once. My Aunt Adela's hand went to her throat. Even Cassius's smooth smile faltered. Serjeant Thorne came to a stand between me and Morwenna, not lunging, not dramatic, simply placing his body in the space where the wrong was about to be completed, the oldest and simplest thing a protector does. He was not a large man, but he seemed to fill the gap entirely. He grounded his rifle. He removed his tall bearskin cap with his left hand. A thing I had never seen a guard do, never once, the bare head shocking somehow, an old soldier's grizzled gray head uncovered in a gallery full of the powerful. And he held it against his chest, and he inclined that bare head, not to Morwenna, but downward and to the side, toward me. My name, he said, and his voice was not loud, but it carried the whole length of the long gallery the way a low note carries, into every corner under every painted queen, is Edric Thorne, Serjeant of the Household Guard of Harrowgate, 31 years sworn. The Queen Consort asked it. There it is, freely given. And now, madam, with respect that is more than you have shown this child, I must tell you what the law of that guard requires of me, since it seems no one else in this room will. You will be silent, Morwenna said, and you will return to your post, and you will be flogged for leaving it. I will not be silent, said Edric Thorne, and I will not return to my post, and you may do with my back as you please when I am finished, madam, for I am an old man, and it will not be the first time it has felt a lash in the service of this crown. But you will hear me first, because the whole company will hear me, and because it is owed. He raised his bare gray head and he looked at her, and I saw her flinch from something in that look, not violence. There was no violence in it, but a kind of absolute unafraid clarity that the powerful almost never have turned on them, because the powerful are surrounded all their lives by people doing arithmetic. Edric Thorne had done his arithmetic and come out the far side of it, and a man who has already decided to lose everything is the freest man alive, and the most dangerous to a tyrant, because there is nothing left to threaten him with. When I took my oath, he said, 31 years ago on the stones of the old chapel, I swore it to the crown of Eldermoor and to the king's peace and to the persons of the blood royal, that I would keep them from all harm within my power to prevent, unto my life. I did not swear it to a lady's temper. I did not swear it to whoever should wear the richest gown into a room. I swore it to the blood. And the child you are commanding onto her knees, madam, this child, Princess Maelin, second daughter of King Alaric, is the blood. She is a princess of Eldermore by birth, by the oldest right there is, the right that no marriage confers and no marriage can take away. And a princess of the blood royal of this kingdom kneels to her sovereign and to God Almighty, and she does not kneel, she will never, while I stand, kneel to a consort. Not to you, madam. Not to anyone who came to this crown by a wedding and not by the blood. That is not cruelty and it is not disrespect. That is the law of the house you married into, and it is older than your marriage, and it will outlast it. You could have heard a pin drop the length of that gallery. I have been in rooms since where nations decided their fate, and I have never again felt a silence with that much weight in it. How dare you, Morwenna breathed. How dare you speak to me of my marriage? Guards, she wheeled toward the walls, toward the 24 red-coated men. Seize this man. Seize him and drag him from this gallery. The first of you to lay hands on him has my favor for life. The last of you to move will share his post. Now. And this was the moment the whole afternoon had been walking toward, and it is the moment I hold on to hardest of all, because it is the moment that taught me what a single man standing correctly can do to a room. Nobody moved. The guards along the walls did not move. Not one of them. 20-odd soldiers and a crowned queen screaming at them to seize an old man, promising favor to the first and ruin to the last, and they stood their stations like the stone they were made to imitate, eyes forward, rifles still, and did not so much as shift their weight. And I understood, even at 9, even then, some part of me understood that they were not frozen with fear. They were choosing. Every one of them had heard Edric Thorne say the law aloud, plain, in words a child could follow, and every one of them knew he had said it true, and every one of them was a man who had sworn the same oath to the same blood on the same old stones, and not one of them would be the man who dragged Isolde's daughter's protector out of a gallery to please a consort's spite. Their stillness had looked like obedience to Morwenna. It had looked like obedience to me. It was the opposite. It was a wall. It had always, I realized, been a wall. I had simply been standing on the wrong side of it, and had not known until this moment that it faced outward, that it had been between us and the dark the whole time. The young, raw-boned guard, the one who had taken his single wretched step, was the one who moved next. He stepped back onto his station, squared himself, grounded his rifle with a crack, and fixed his eyes forward beside the empty station Edric Thorne had left, and in doing so he cast his lot as plainly as if he had shouted it. He was the youngest and the newest and the most afraid, and he had almost done the wrong thing, and now he stood as straight as any of them, and I have loved the sight of a frightened person choosing rightly ever since, because I saw it first on his young, miserable face in the gold light of that gallery. Morwenna stood alone in the middle of the floor. That was the shape of it suddenly, and it was her own doing entirely. She had meant to put a child alone in the middle of the floor, small and surrendering, with the whole court arrayed above her. And instead, by her own words and her own overreach, she had put herself there, one woman in silver, ringed by a court that would not meet her eyes, by soldiers who would not obey her, by an old man with a bare gray head who had told the truth out loud, and by 4 children of the woman she hated, who were not kneeling, who were on their feet, who were watching her the way you watch a storm move off at last across a field. She looked around the gallery for an ally. Cassius had gone still and careful, a man feeling which way the wind had turned and beginning already to lean into it. Verena's laughter was long gone. Lord Pruitt was staring at his ordinances as though he might climb inside them. My Aunt Adela was smiling, a cold, savage, triumphant smile. And the painted queens looked down from the wall, and under her curtain my mother waited, and Morwenna, Queen Consort of Eldermore, had never in her whole climbing, calculating life looked smaller than she looked in the instant she understood that she had lost the room. But she was not a woman who lost gracefully. The powerful rarely are. It is a skill they never have to learn. "This is mutiny," she said, and her voice shook now, shrill at the edges. "This is treason, An armed man has left his post and defied his queen before the ambassadors of a foreign crown. Do you understand what you have done, all of you? When the king hears, when the king hears, said a new voice from the far end of the gallery, he will want it told slowly, and from the beginning, and I think, Morwenna, that you had better not be the one to tell it. Every head turned, and there in the great doorway at the end of the long gallery, framed against the light of the hall beyond, having heard God knows how much, having been fetched, I learned later, by a breathless page whom my aunt had sent running at the first demand, stood my father, King Alaric of Eldermore. And behind his shoulder, still in his riding clothes, mud to the knee, having ridden hard from the flood districts the moment the same page found him on the road, stood my eldest brother, the Crown Prince Rowan. The king had come home to his wife's portrait, and had found his second wife trying to break his dead wife's child in front of the world. My father did not rush. That was his way in a crisis. He had a stillness of his own, not the guard's disciplined statue, but the heavier stillness of a man who has learned that a king who hurries has already lost. He walked the length of the long gallery slowly, and the court parted before him, and his eyes moved over the whole scene and read it the way a general reads a field. The old guard bareheaded and out of line, the young guard rigid and pale, the chamberlain gray with his ordinances, Adela's fierce cold smile, Morwenna alone on the floor, and his 4 children standing, not kneeling, with Bram's tears drying on his cheeks and Torrin still planted in front of me like a small furious gatepost. Alaric, Morwenna began, and she had recovered something of her voice, smoothed it, poured the honey back into it. Thank heaven you have come. There has been a terrible insubordination. This man. Be quiet. My father did not raise his voice. He said it the way you might set down something heavy. You will have your turn. You have had, it seems, a great deal of turn already. He turned from her, turned his back on the Queen Consort in front of the whole court, a thing that was itself a verdict, and he looked at Serjeant Thorne, and the 2 old men regarded one another, for they were of an age, and I later learned they had known each other the better part of 30 years, the king and the guard who had stood his doors. Serjeant Thorne, my father said, you have left your post. I have, sire. In the middle of a ceremony, before ambassadors, uncovered. A pause. Bareheaded, Edric, in a public gallery. I have not seen you bareheaded since Isolde's funeral. No, sire. Tell me why. And Serjeant Thorne told him. He told it plainly and shortly, a soldier's report, without heat and without mercy, the demand that a princess of the blood kneel to the consort, the chamberlain's ruling, the command given to a soldier to lay hands on the king's son, the 4th demand, the child beginning to kneel. He left nothing out and he added nothing. And when he came to the end of it, he said, I stopped her from kneeling, sire, and I stepped between, and I told the company the law of the guard that the blood royal does not kneel to a consort. If I was wrong in the law, I will take my punishment. If I was wrong to leave my post, I was not wrong to leave my post. I gave a promise once to keep these children from harm within my power, and it was within my power, and so I kept it. That is the whole of it. Do with me as you will. My father was silent for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, To whom did you give that promise, Edric? And I watched the old soldier's throat work, and I watched him decide, after 2 years of silence, to say the thing he had carried, because his king had asked him plainly, and a guard does not lie to his king. To the queen, sire, he said, to Queen Isolde, on the last night, she bade me watch over her children when she could not. His voice did not break, but it went rough, the way old stone goes rough. I have tried to keep it quietly as she would have wished. Today it could not be kept quietly. I am sorry for the noise of it, sire. I am not sorry for the rest. I heard my father breathe in. I saw something move across his face that I had almost never seen there. My father was not a man who wept in public. Kings are not permitted it, but something moved, and his jaw set, and when he spoke again his voice had changed, had gone low and thick, and he said, She never told me. She gave you the last order of her life, and she never told me, because she knew I would only weep and you would only keep it." He put his hand for a moment over his own eyes, one moment, and then took it away, and he was the king again. "You have kept it, Serjeant. God knows you have kept it. Put your cap on. You will not stand bareheaded in front of these people. You have earned better than that today." Serjeant Thorne put on his cap. And then my father did the thing that ended it. Not the arrest of anyone, not a shout, but the thing that turned the whole afternoon inside out and made of Morwenna's cruelty the instrument of her own undoing. He turned to me. He crossed the last of the floor and he knelt down, my father, the king, in his robes of state, knelt down on the cold, pale stone of the long gallery so that his eyes were level with mine, and he took both my hands in his. "Maelin," he said, "my daughter, look at me. You were asked to kneel today, and I am sorry it fell to you, and I am sorrier that I was not here. So let me show you, and let me show all of them, how it is truly done in the house of Harrowgate." And he raised his voice, and he did not rise from his knee. "Serjeant Thorne, you told this company that a princess of the blood kneels to her sovereign. I am her sovereign. And I tell you now that a sovereign who is worth the crown he wears kneels, when the moment asks it, to the honor of his own house. Isolde's honor, this child's honor, let it be seen." He bowed his head to me. The king bowed his head to a 9-year-old girl, and Serjeant Edric Thorne, without a word, grounded his rifle and went down on one knee before me and bowed his gray head, and the young raw-boned guard went down beside him. And then all along the length of the long gallery, the red-coated men grounded their rifles and knelt, one after another, a wave of them, 20 and more, the whole household guard of Harrowgate on one knee to Isolde's daughter. And my Aunt Adela knelt, still with that fierce, bright look. And my brother Rowan, mud to the knee, knelt. And Alara knelt, and Torin knelt beside her, and even little Bram, not understanding everything, folded down onto the stone. And then the court, because a court follows its king the way water follows the shape of the ground, the court knelt too, the great lords and the ladies and the foreign ambassadors in their strange, rich clothes, 100 people going down onto the cold stone of the long gallery, under the painted queens, before the curtained portrait of my mother, to the daughter of Isolde. Everyone in that vast room knelt. Everyone but one. Morwenna stood alone in the center of the floor, in her cloth of silver, the only figure left standing in a gallery of kneeling people, and there is no crueler light to be caught standing in than the light of 100 bowed backs. She had wanted, more than she had wanted anything in her climbing life, to be the one everyone knelt to. And now everyone knelt in the same room in the same hour, and not one of them knelt to her, and she could not kneel to me without shattering, and she could not stand without being seen by every soul present as the one thing she had spent her whole life refusing to be, which was alone and refused and wrong. Her face, when I looked up at it from the floor, had gone the color of the stone. She had been so beautiful an hour before. She did not look beautiful now. She looked like what she was, which is a thing the powerful spend fortunes to never have to look like, and here she was looking like it in front of everyone who mattered. "Get up," she said to the room, to no one, her voice cracking. "Get up, all of you. This is absurd. Alaric, get up, this is beneath you, it is beneath the crown you make a spectacle of." "I make a spectacle of nothing," said my father, rising now, lifting me up by the hands as he came, so that I rose with him and stood and did not kneel, and would never that day kneel. "You made the spectacle, madam, when you tried to force my daughter to her knees in front of the crowned heads of 3 realms on the day I laid my first wife's memory to honor. You made it. I am only letting the company see the whole of it, and letting them see how a decent house answers it. And now," he said, and his voice dropped, and the last of the warmth went out of it, and what was left was the winter that lives at the bottom of every good king when he has finally been pushed to the floor of himself. "Now, Morwenna, you and I are going to have a conversation that will not be pleasant for you, and it will not be here in front of these children, for I will not do to your dignity what you tried to do to my daughters." "Lord Prewitt." "Sire," whispered the Chamberlain from his knees. You ruled, I am told, that the Queen Consort held authority to force a princess of the blood onto her knees in penance before the court. You keep the ordinances of this house. Bring them to my study within the hour and show me the line that says it, and if you cannot find the line, we will discuss what a chamberlain is for who bends the law to the loudest voice in the room. Get up. Go. Pruitt went, folding himself away through the kneeling crowd like a man escaping a fire. The court rose slowly, in a great rustle of silk and creaking of knees. And my father, because he was a wiser man than his grief and his anger, did a thing that I did not appreciate until I was much older and had a household of my own to keep. He did not let the afternoon end on Morwenna. He would not give her even that, the distinction of being the thing the day was remembered for. Instead, he turned to the curtained portrait and he held out his hand to me and he said, loudly enough for the whole gallery, "We came here to raise your mother, Maelin. Let us raise her. Will you draw the curtain? It should be her daughter's hand." I was 9 and my legs were shaking and my face was wet and I did not feel brave. But I took the tasseled cord in both hands and my father steadied me, and I pulled, and the heavy velvet slid away and there was my mother. The painter had caught her. That is the only way I can say it. He had caught the thing the realm had loved, not a stiff-crowned queen glaring out of the canvas the way the older portraits down the gallery all did, but Isolde as she truly was, half-turned as though someone had just said her name, the beginning of a smile at the corner of her mouth, her hands not folded regally but open, a little as though she were about to reach out and take yours. She was wearing blue. My blue, the blue of the gown I had on. And the light in the painting came from the same direction as the real gold light lying along the gallery floor, so that for a moment, a trick of the eye, she seemed to be lit by the very afternoon we were standing in, as though she had been there the whole time, watching, and had only now let herself be seen. The gallery was silent, and then it was not silent. There was a sound going through it, a low, broken sound, and it took me a moment to understand that it was 100 people weeping, quietly, the way grown people weep when they have been holding it a long time. The ambassadors wept. The great lords wept. My father stood with his hand on my shoulder and looked at his first wife's painted face, and let the tears run down into his beard and did not wipe them away. Because a king is permitted to weep, it turns out, at the raising of a good queen, and only then. And Serjeant Edric Thorne, back in his place along the wall, for he had returned to his station the moment the kneeling was done, because that was who he was, the drama over, the promise kept, the soldier back at his post. Serjeant Thorne stood his stone-still station with the tears standing in his eyes and not falling, looking at the portrait of the woman whose last order he had just, at the cost of everything he owned, finished keeping. He did not know I was watching him. I have never told him I was. But I saw the old soldier look at my mother's face, and I saw his lips move once, and though I could not hear it, I have always been certain of the shape of the words, because they were the same words he had said to her in the dark 2 winters before, the only reply a man like that ever gives to a queen or to God. "Yes, my queen." That is the end of what happened in the long gallery. But it is not the end of the story, because a wrong that is stopped is not the same as a wrong that is answered, and my father was not a man to leave the second half of a thing undone. I did not see the conversation between the king and Morwenna. No one did. It was held behind the doors of his study with only my Aunt Adela present as witness, and Adela, who could keep a secret the way a vault keeps gold, never told me the words of it. But I saw what came out of it over the days and weeks that followed, and the realm saw, and I can tell you the shape of the reckoning even if I cannot give you its exact words. Morwenna was not executed. I want to say that plainly, because when I tell this story to the children of the almshouses, their eyes go wide and bloodthirsty at this point, and they want a terrible end. They want the villain thrown from a tower, and I have to tell them that the world is not a ballad and that my father was a just man and not a cruel one, and that the justice of a good king is a quieter and more lasting thing than the vengeance of a bad one. She was not harmed. She was not imprisoned. What was done to her was in some ways worse, for a woman built as she was built, and in every way more fitting. She was unmade at court. My father stripped her, that same week, of all authority over the king's children and over the household. The very authority she had reached for in the gallery was the first thing taken from her, so that she who had tried to command us could not so much as order our supper thereafter. He removed her from the council of the realm, where she had schemed a place for herself, and he made it known, in the 100 wordless ways a court makes such things known, that the Queen Consort no longer had his ear or his trust or his favor, and a consort who has lost those 3 things has lost everything, for she has no blood right of her own. Her whole standing is on loan from the king's regard, and my father called the loan in. She kept her title, because it was hers by the marriage, and he would not shame the crown by a scandal of annulment before the foreign courts. But a title with nothing beneath it is a cold and hollow thing to hold, and she held it, in the years after, the way you hold a beautiful cup you have discovered is empty and can never fill. And the court, which had knelt to me in the gallery, knew which way the wind had set, and courts are merciless to the fallen in exact proportion to how they fawned on the risen. The lords who had studied their shoes while she demanded my knees now studied their shoes when she entered a room. The ladies who had laughed at Morwenna's jokes found they had pressing business elsewhere. Within a season, Morwenna, who had married a correction and grasped at a throne, was the loneliest woman in Harrogate, moving through its halls in her fine gowns with fewer and fewer eyes willing to meet her own, and I would be lying if I told you I felt no satisfaction in it, at 9, and for some years after. It was only much later, when I was grown and had learned the harder, better work my mother spoke of, that I could look at the memory of that lonely, diminished woman and feel something nearer to pity than to triumph. But I will not pretend I felt it then. Then I was a child who had almost been broken, and I watched the person who had almost broken me become small, and I was glad. Her children read the weather faster than she did. Lord Cassius, who had felt the wind shift in the gallery itself, you will remember, and begun already to lean into it, reinvented himself with a speed that would have been admirable in a better cause. Within the month he was to be found at my brother Rowan's elbow, all deference and usefulness, having discovered a deep and sudden loyalty to the true line of Harrogate. Rowan, who was no fool, kept him close the way you keep a knife you know to be a knife, where you can see it. Lady Morwenna married, quickly and well below what her mother had once dreamed for her, into a quiet country house 3 days' ride from the capital, and was seldom seen at court again, and I am told she grew almost content out there among her gardens, away from the game her mother had raised her to play, which perhaps is the kindest thing that could have happened to her. I have not hated them, Cassius and Morwenna, the way one is supposed to hate the children of a villain. They were only what they had been made. It is their mother I have never quite been able to hand over entirely to forgiveness, though I have tried, because she chose, and they were choices she made, and a grown woman who chooses to try to break a child cannot lay it at anyone's door but her own. But I have gotten ahead of the part that matters most, which is not what became of Morwenna, but what became of the old soldier who stepped out of the line. There was a matter of law to be settled, you understand, and my father, being a just king, would not simply wave it away because his heart was in it. A guard had left his post. That is a real offense, one of the oldest and gravest in the code of the household guard, and it does not stop being an offense because the guard was right to do it, any more than a fire stops being a fire because it warmed you. If the king had simply pardoned Serjeant Thorne with a smile and a purse of gold, he would have taught every soldier in Harrogate that a post may be abandoned whenever a man feels strongly enough, and that lesson, my father knew, would one day get a king killed. So he did not do the easy, warm thing. He convened the matter formally, 3 days later, before the assembled officers of the guard, and he had the charge read out, that Serjeant Edric Thorne did, on such a day, quit his appointed station during a ceremony of state. And then he had the whole of it examined properly in the daylight, the way a serious thing deserves to be examined. He called witnesses. He called my Aunt Adela, who told it cold and exact. He called Lord Prewitt, who had by then failed entirely to find in the ordinances any line granting a consort the power he had granted her, and who confessed as much, sweating, and was lucky to keep his post at all. He called the young raw-boned guard. His name was Corin, I learned, and I have made sure he was looked after all his life since, who told, in a voice that shook but did not stop, how the sergeant had told him to hold, and how he had come to understand that the sergeant's order was the lawful one and the Queen's was not. And he called me. I was 9, and I stood in front of a room full of soldiers and my own father the king, and I was asked to say what had happened, and I said it. I told them about the demand and the cold of the stone and the honey in her voice, and how I had begun to kneel to make everyone's fear stop, and how a hand had closed around my arm gently, so gently, and had held me up, and how the old surgeon had said, "Not you, Highness, never you," and stepped out of the line. I did not tell it well. I cried in the middle, but I told it true, and when I was finished the room of hard old soldiers was very quiet, and my father said, "Thank you, Princess. You may sit by your aunt," and I did. And then the king gave his judgment, and I have never forgotten it, and I have used it myself, in my own smaller judgments all my life. "The charge is proved," my father said. Serjeant Thorne left his post. "The code is clear, and the code is right to be clear, and I will not pretend otherwise, for the day a king pretends the law is soft is the day the law dies. A post is a sacred thing. A man who leaves it lightly betrays every man beside him. So let it be recorded that the charge is proved, and that the king has considered it gravely." He let that sit. And then, "But the code that binds a guard to his post is not the highest law he serves. It is the servant of a higher one, the law that binds him to the protection of the blood royal and the king's peace, which is the very reason the post exists at all. A post is not an end. It is a means. And when a man is faced, as this man was faced, with keeping the letter of the lesser law or the whole purpose of the greater, when to stand still at his station would have been to permit the very harm his station exists to prevent, then the man who leaves his post to prevent that harm has not betrayed his oath. He has kept it in the only way it could be kept, at the highest cost the keeping could ask of him. Serjeant Thorne did not abandon his duty in that gallery. He performed it. He is the only man in that room, myself included, who performed it fully and at once. The charge is proved, and the man is exonerated, and there is no contradiction in those two things, and any officer in this room who does not understand how they live together has not yet understood what it is we are for. He rose, but exoneration is not enough, for a debt is owed, and a king who does not pay his debts is no king. Edric Thorne. "Come forward." And the old soldier came forward and knelt, to his king, lawfully, the way the blood does not kneel to a consort, but every subject kneels to the crown, and my father drew his sword, the plain old campaign sword he preferred to the jeweled ceremonial one, and he did not knight him, for Thorne had refused knighthood twice already in his life, and would refuse it a third time that day, being a man who wanted no title but the one he had earned 31 years before. Instead, my father did a thing that was rarer, and that meant more. He created, by royal word on the spot, a new post that had not existed in Harrowgate before, captain of the princess's guard, and he gave it to Edric Thorne, and he charged him, in front of the assembled officers, with the safety and the honor of the children of Queen Isolde, openly now, by law and by day, the very charge my mother had given him in secret in the dark. He took the promise Thorne had carried alone for 2 years, and he set it in stone, and made the whole realm a witness to it. "You kept my wife's last order when no one knew you kept it," my father said low, for the two of them, though the room heard. "You will keep it now with the whole kingdom to help you. Rise, captain. You have a great deal of work, and I think you would rather be at it than listen to an old friend thank you, so I will not embarrass us both. Rise." Thorne rose, and that was the whole of his reward, and it was exactly the reward he would have chosen, and my father knew it, because they had been young men together a long time ago, and a good king knows his good men. He was my captain from that day until the day he died, and he died at his post, which is to say he died an old man in a chair by the door of my apartments, having sat down for a moment in the winter sun of an afternoon and never risen. And I was there, and I held his hand, and it was still at the end, exactly as strong and exactly as gentle as it had been the day it closed around a 9-year-old's arm and would not let her kneel. He watched over all 4 of us the whole of his life. He stood at Alara's wedding and at Torrhen's first commission, and he taught Bram to sit a horse, gruffly, endlessly patient. He never married. The guard was his family, and we were his children as much as anyone's. And when people asked him, and people did ask over the years drawn by the story, wanting the great heroic reason why he had done it, why one old soldier had risked his whole life in living to stop one small humiliation, he never gave them the grand answer they came for. He would look at them, and the scar would catch the light, and he would say only, "Because it was mine to do, and no one else was doing it." That was all, because it was mine to do, and no one else was doing it. I have those words carved now over the door of the almshouses my mother founded, and I read them every day, and I have tried to live so that they might one day be true of me. The portrait of my mother hangs in the long gallery still. It hangs where it was raised, in the gold afternoon light, half turned as though someone has just said her name, her hands a little open. Children are brought to see it. And when they stand before it, the guides who show them round tell them, if they ask about the strange old story attached to that particular painting, about the day a queen consort tried to make a little princess kneel on the cold stone floor beneath it, and about the one guard, out of a whole silent gallery of them, who stepped out of the line. I am the little princess. I have been many things since: a woman grown, a keeper of my mother's works, a person who has sat in rooms where the fate of the realm was weighed, and who has, once or twice, been the only one in such a room willing to say the plain true thing out loud when everyone else was doing their arithmetic. Each time, I have thought of the cold of that stone coming up through my thin shoes, and of the honey in a cruel voice, and of 100 people who did nothing. And each time I have thought, too, of a warm iron hand closing gently around my arm, and a rough low voice saying, "Not you, Highness, never you," and I have found that I was able, after all, to be the one who stepped out of the line. That is what he gave me. Not rescue, though he gave me that too. He gave me the knowledge, carried in my own body ever since, that the wall of stone along the edge of every terrible room may look like indifference and may in truth be facing outward, may be the last thing standing between the dark and the ones too small to guard themselves, and that any one of us, on any ordinary afternoon, might be the stone that turns and speaks and holds. I never knelt. I want that to be the thing you remember out of all of it. On the day the whole world tried to make me small, I did not kneel, because a man I had given up on decided that I would not, and paid for it what he was willing to pay and asked for nothing back. They still tell the story wrong sometimes. They say the king saved the princess, or that justice saved her, or that the truth came out and saved her. But I was there on the floor, halfway down, with the words already in my mouth. It was not the king. It was not justice, which came later and slowly, the way it does. It was one old sergeant with gray at his temples and a scar along his jaw, and a dead queen's promise folded up inside his chest, who was not braver than the 100 others in that gallery, only clearer about what was his to do, and who, at the exact moment the whole world needed him to, stopped being a statue and became a guardian, and ended the drama the only way such a drama can ever truly be ended. Not with a blow, but with a single man standing correctly in a room full of people standing wrong. That is the story. That is Serjeant Edric Thorne. And that is why, when the children of the almshouses ask me what a royal guard is for, I do not tell them about the bearskin cap or the polished rifle or the standing still. I tell them, he is for the moment you cannot see coming, when you are small and afraid and everyone who could help you has decided it is not their place. He is the one who decides that it is. Kneel to no one who has not earned it, I tell them. Stand for anyone who cannot stand for themselves. And if you are ever the only one in the room who will say the true thing out loud, say it. Someone did that for me once on a cold stone floor, a long time ago. I have spent my whole life trying to be worth it. I think, most days, that he would say I have come near enough.